Well, good afternoon, folks. Hopefully everybody's getting in the webinar here today for us. My name is Bill Costanzo. I'm the Livestock Guardian Dog Research Specialist here at the AgriLife Center in San Angelo. With me today is Dr. Kathryn Lord. She'll be presenting our webinar today on canine behavior. I do want to thank a few people and go over a few housekeeping things here real quick. We will do all of the questions at the end of the presentation today. If you do get completely lost on maybe some of the more scientific topics, feel free to post that in the chat, and we'll try to pause the presentation there to clear up some things for you. I'd like to thank Dr. Redden. He's our center director for his support of the program and guidance. The Sheep and Goat Predator Management Board, who provides the funding for my position here at the AgriLife Center. Robert Pritz and Jamie Sanford for helping us get the Zoom going today and taking care of all the technical things with our presentation today. Our sponsor today is Lone Star Tracking. Those of you that follow our Facebook page know that we get all of our GPS trackers from Lone Star. So if you're looking for any GPS trackers, feel free to contact Thomas or Mark over there at Lone Star Tracking. So Dr. Lord is currently a postdoctoral associate in the Carlson Lab at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. Her main interest is in the evolutionary development of animal behavior and its application to the management of domestic and wild species. She received her PhD from the University of Massachusetts in orgasmic and evolutionary biology with Dr. Raymond Coppinger. Her dissertation examined developmental explanations for major behavioral differences between wolves, dogs, and breeds. Her research and publications have focused on evolution, development, and genetics of dog and wolf behavior. Her work has been published in professional journals, including Animal Behavior, Behavioral Processes, Ethology, Trends in Ecology and Evolution, and Science. She served as a faculty at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and also the Gettysburg College at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Dr. Lord, but the Canisius College in Buffalo, New York. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Dr. Lord. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to post those in the chat, and we'll get to them here at the end.
Great. Thanks so much. And thank you so much for inviting me, Bill, and for all of you for coming to join us today. I have to say I was thrilled to get this invite on two levels. One, because Ray would have been really excited to know that your group exists, and two, to get to talk to you guys today about some of this work. So I just wanted to start by letting you know, let me just make sure, there we go. Letting you know a bit about myself and why I study dogs and wolves. So as Bill mentioned, my main interest is in the evolution and development of animal behavior. And it turns out that dogs and wolves are really fantastic for studying this particular topic. And that's because dogs actually evolved fairly recently to survive in a very different environment from wolves. So wolves have evolved to survive by hunting large prey, whereas dogs have evolved to scavenge off of our garbage and refuse. And so because of that, they've had a lot of really big behavioral changes between the two of them, including what they eat, of course, so foraging and how they go about getting that food, but also in how they avoid hazards, so how they respond to things that are frightening, and how they determine what's familiar or not, as well as reproduction. But with all of these behavioral differences, genetically, they've remained very similar to one another. And so this means that they're wonderful for trying to figure out how those behavioral differences occur, both within the lifetime of the animal, but also evolutionarily, so over generations, and what genes or what genetic mechanisms are actually driving those changes, which has applications not only for the more theoretical end of things, but also for the applied end of things, especially for working lines where we're interested in producing certain behaviors, both in the entire line, genetically speaking, but also in the individuals over their lifetime. So a lot of these behavioral differences come back down to one early developmental period that I spend a lot of time studying, and that is the primary critical period of socialization. And so this is a time period early in the life of all mammals, as well as birds, when the brain is growing extremely rapidly. And because of that, it's very plastic and can change in response to the information coming into the brain through the senses. This means that anything experienced during this time positively becomes permanently familiar. It's also when they develop species recognition, or what species they actually are, and when they develop flight distance, which is how close they allow something to approach before they start running and how far they run. Now, what I plan on talking to you about today is this particular period of socialization, and focusing on two main behaviors, which I think are of most interest to livestock guarding dogs. One is this hazard avoidance idea, or how they run away from or don't run away from things, but also the process of socialization with other species falls into that, which is obviously a big one for livestock guarding dogs. And so I'm going to go through what we already know about how hazard avoidance is affected by this early developmental period and how that kind of ties in with livestock guarding dogs. And then what we're trying to figure out about this period and hazard avoidance, and some of the projects we'd like to do, including livestock guarding dogs. Then if we have time, I think we will, especially if questions are at the end, we will go into the foraging end of things, which doesn't seem to obviously tie into livestock guarding dogs, perhaps, but this is where all of those annoying behaviors like chase and biting and all of that sort of thing come up, because those were actually wolf foraging behaviors that still exist in dogs. And so we'll talk a bit about what we know about the development of those behaviors and how it relates to this critical period and what we're trying to figure out. So to start with, let's talk about what we know about the critical period of socialization in general in dogs and how it relates to this hazard avoidance behavior. So there's been a lot of work on this developmental period in dogs, mostly in the 50s and 60s. And what it all boils down to is that this time period, this critical period, starts in dogs with the ability to walk, but not just stand up and walk, but explore their environment. So they have to be coordinated walking and exploring their environment. And that in dogs starts around 4 weeks of age. At this point, they have pretty much no fear of new things. So they'll walk up to Godzilla and not really think much about it. But over the next 4 weeks, this fear gradually increases. So by 5 weeks, they're noticing the difference between new versus familiar things. This actually serves to increase exploration. Then at 6 weeks, they might start balking a little bit at really new things. 7 weeks, it gets a bit worse. And by 8 weeks, if something is entirely novel, so no familiar elements to it, they will run away rather than explore that particular thing. And that brings this critical period to a close. So it's 4 weeks long, starting at 4 weeks and ending at 8 weeks in dogs. Now, as I mentioned, this period is characterized by rapid brain growth. And this is some data from Ray and Lorna's 2001 book. It was made using Maremas. And they're born with a brain volume of 8 cc's, so pretty small. And as adults, their brain volume is 100 cc's. 50% of the brain growth that ever happens in these animals happens in that first 2 months, during that first 8 weeks, overlapping with that critical period. So there's a lot of development happening. In comparison, over the next 2 months, only 30% of the brain growth occurs, and then the remaining 20% happens over the next 8 months. So there's a lot of rapid development occurring during this time. So when I say brain growth, what is actually occurring? When pups are born, they have pretty much all the brain cells, all the neurons that they're ever going to have in their life. What's really changing is the connections between those brain cells. So that happens basically through experience. So here on the right, we have a pup, and that information that the pup is, that's going to that pup's brain is coming in through the senses. So that could be through touch, it could be through hearing, it could be through vision, and it could be through olfaction. Any of those are conduits for that information to come in. And once they come in, they hit the brain cells or the neurons. And on the left, we have some very stylized pictures of neurons. Neurons actually don't look like this, but they look very complicated. And so we simplify them to look like this. And so basically they come in on this side, backwards, sorry. They come in from the right here, from the dendrites down this long stalk called the axon. So the information comes in that direction, then it jumps over a little gap in the synapses here to another neuron. So it passes that information to the next neuron, and it continues on to pass it to another neuron. Now, in reality, there's a whole network of neurons, and an individual neuron passes its information onto a whole bunch of other neurons, and a whole bunch of other neurons pass their information on to each single neuron. But the basic idea is that during this time period, if information is passed from one neuron to another, that connection is solidified and strengthened. Whereas if information is not passed from one neuron to another, that connection gets pruned away. And so it no longer exists. And in this way, the shape of the brain and the information it can process and how it processes it gets developed through the experiences of that pup. So this was shown really nicely in some work done between the 50s and the 70s by a whole bunch of different people. But we're going to talk about this one experiment by Blakemore and Cooper, and it's actually on kittens, but it's the same idea. They were looking at the development of the vision in kittens, which happens in the first 6 weeks of their life. And so what they did was, as soon as the kitten's eyes open, they placed them in an environment where they could only see vertical lines or only see horizontal lines. So in this picture, the kitten can only see vertical lines. He's got a little cone of shame on, so he can't see even his own body. All he can see is these vertical lines. And they raised them like that till they were 6 weeks old, at which point they took them out and put them in a normal environment on top of a table. And these kittens just walked right off the edge of the table because their brains developed to see vertical lines because they were getting that information, but they never got the horizontal line information. So those connections were pruned and they couldn't see the horizontal table edge, and they just walked right off of it. But when they put them under the table, they could maneuver around those vertically oriented table legs just fine because their brain developed to see vertical lines. When they did the same experiment with the horizontal line kittens, they walked around on the tabletop without any trouble because they could see horizontal lines, but their brain never developed the ability to see vertical lines, so they bumped into the table legs when they were put underneath it. So what comes into the brain during this time is extremely important in how the brain responds to the environment of the animal as an adult and its later behavior. So the next thing that goes along with this is this experiencing things and making them immediately familiar. So during this 4 to 8 week period in dogs, if dogs have a positive experience with something, it remains familiar for the rest of their lives. So a nice example of this is stairs. This is actually a little enrichment device that I created for guide dogs. These are obviously not guide dogs, but this was just a little test. So these are little stairs for the pups to walk up, and there's little street grates at the top as well. And so the idea here is that if a pup experiences any kind of stairs during this period, then as adults, they'll be fine with stairs. But if they never experience stairs, as adults, they'll be frightened of stairs and not be able to go up and down them. Now, you could train an adult dog to get to habituate to stairs so that they aren't terrified of them, but that's going to take you a really long time. And as soon as you change anything about that staircase, it has no risers, it has walls on both sides, there's a trash can at the top, the dog's going to balk again and be frightened. who experience stairs during the first 4 to 8 weeks are going to be fine with stairs, and they'll generalize from there. So it's the same idea. Their brain is developing in a way that they can just take this information in immediately and keep going. Now, when I talk about this with people who know, they start to ask, well, but people get dogs at 8 weeks and they're fine. And is it really 4 to 8 weeks? I've heard different numbers for fear periods or fear stages. And those are usually referring to this time period, but there was a lot of confusion when this work was early on in its development. So between the 40s and the 60s, there was a lot of information coming out about this time period. A lot of it by J.P. Scott, who wrote a book with Fuller, which you may be familiar with. And every time that Scott wrote a paper, he looked at slightly different ages. And so each paper has slightly different ages it talks about, which is terribly confusing. But when you lump them all together, you get a pretty solid picture of what's going on. And what's actually happening is that the sensitivity of the brain, the plasticity of the brain to its environment starts back at around 2 weeks of age and then rapidly increases with its maximal plasticity between 4 and 8 weeks. And then it tailors back off all the way out to 16 weeks. So this means when the dog is left to its own devices, the primary critical period of socialization is between 4 to 8 weeks. It starts when they can explore their environment and take in this information, and is brought to a close by fear. But that doesn't mean that we can't, by interfering, extend the effects of this critical period to actually take up this whole sensitive time period. And so dogs are actually developing their senses back here they're born with a sense of touch. In the first week, they can then smell, then their eyes open in the second week, although they aren't really seeing at this point. It's pretty much light and shadow because of what I just told you about. That information hasn't gone into the eye, so very little is hooked up in the brain. There's some automatic stuff going on, which allows them to see light and shadow, but they need the visual information to actually get that to turn into pictures and really be adult-like. So they're really just seeing light and shadow when their eyes open. Similarly, their ears open at 3 weeks. Some sound can actually get in before their ears open, so it's more developed than when the eyes open, but it's still not adult-like until 4 weeks. And then they're hearing like they will when they're adults, and they can see shapes and actually show what we call visually guided behavior, where they see something at a distance and walk towards it. So what all this means is that you can actually interfere with a pup back in the second week and give it all sorts of smells, and that will have a big effect on how its brain develops. Or you can do things like provide touch stimulus, like some people do little squeezing of the toes or touching them with Q-tips or things like that, which can have a big effect on the development of their brains before they would naturally be doing anything on themselves. Similarly, after 8 weeks, we can interfere. And so, for example, if a pup ended up out, it was in one location and then went to a home after 8 weeks and balks at the first time it sees a trash can with a fluttery trash bag, it's very scared and would normally run away, but it has a familiar person there. They can touch that trash can and add an element of familiarity to it. And then that means that the dog can explore it and still get that benefit like they would have during 4 to 8 weeks. It's not quite as plastic at that point, so it might take a few introductions, but you still get that benefit all the way out until 16 weeks of age. So we can extend it artificially, so to speak, with our own actions. Just checking in the chat to see if anybody is lost. So a good pausing spot. Okay, I think we're just furiously taking notes. I'm not seeing anything specific. Oh, one new, hang on. Okay, great. All right, so we're moving, oops, I jumped ahead there, sorry. So moving on to perhaps the most exciting part for livestock guarding dogs, let me put this so you can see what I'm doing, is species recognition. So normally in any species going through this primary critical period of socialization, whatever they are, this would be when they learned what species they were. So when a goat learned that it was a goat, and a person learned they were a person, and a bear learned it's a bear. But again, humans can interfere with this. And so some of the earliest work with this was actually with livestock and with chickens and with ducks, where we discovered that if we introduced a person during this time, we could actually get the animal to follow the person instead of their own species. So normally they develop their own species recognition during this time, but we can get animals to form social bonds with other species during this time as well, which is precisely what you do with livestock guardian dogs, getting the dog to socialize with whatever it is that they will need to be attentive to as an adult. And so turns out that dogs are pretty amazing at this, just across species. When we look at any other species, dogs are, this is sort of their superpower. We've managed to socialize them with just about every species we've tried. The trick is you just need something that isn't scared of them or going to attack them, and that they have this positive experience with, so that they can form the social bonds. And we've gotten dogs to socialize with cats, with rabbits, with rats, with turtles, with pretty much anything, not just people and livestock. And to me, this is really exciting because it's evolutionarily, it's quite interesting. If we compare this ability in dogs to, say, wolves, it really highlights how good they are at this. So in dogs, if we expose a dog to a person for 90 minutes between the ages of 4 and 8 weeks, they will start to solicit attention from that person. So they're already starting the process with just total of 90 minutes during that time. That's not 90 minutes every day or 90 minutes a week. It's just 90 minutes overall, and they will develop this soliciting attention from people. Not going to be a bomb-proof dog, not going to be good with everybody, but it's already starting the process. This is in comparison, if you want to socialize wolves to humans, you got to do it starting before 3 weeks of age, and you got to keep them in contact with humans 24 hours a day. Up until around 4 to 6 weeks, it really depends when they start biting you in the ears and you can't stand it anymore. And then they stay in human contact for all waking hours. And after that, around 16 weeks, they still have to keep up daily human contact to keep up that human socialization. So it's super intensive in comparison. We've really only managed to socialize them with humans, somewhat with dogs, so they can get dangerous with dogs once they're grown up. And that's it, as opposed to the dogs who are just magical at this. And we think that the difference between them, what allows this in dogs, is a change in the timing of this primary critical period of socialization. So again, 4 to 8 weeks in dogs, starting with this ability to walk, ending with this avoidance of novelty. But if we look for the same biomarkers in wolves, we see that wolves are actually starting to walk back at 2 weeks and explore their environment, and showing the avoidance of novelty at around 6 weeks. So that's a 2-week shift, but it's the same length critical period. That on its own doesn't explain this difference. But when we add in the development of the senses, suddenly the picture becomes clear, because the dogs are developing all their senses and then starting to explore. So during this 4 weeks, they're getting a complete picture of everything they experience. They experience what it sounds like, what it smells like, what it looks like, what it feels like if they touch it. And any one of those sensory inputs can be used to identify it as familiar after the critical period. The wolves are functionally blind and deaf for half of their critical period. So they're really focusing down on what does this smell like? And then they're adding on the information of what does this sound like and what does it look like? And this also explains why we would need to socialize them before 3 weeks of age, because if you think about a wolf pup being pulled out of the den and put into a human environment, absolutely nothing would be familiar in that environment. So if we start after 3 weeks and their ears open, everything they hear is new because they've never heard anything before. And everything they're smelling is new because they're in a completely different environment. They'll be scared because they're 1 week into the critical period, and they'll run away because this is just really new. that'll interrupt the socialization process. They'll get over it because they're in the middle of the critical period, but just as they do, they start to see, and everything they see is scary, and they run away again. And so when you try to socialize wolves late like this, you kind of get a reduction in flight distance, but you never get the social bonds form. As opposed to what we normally do, which is pull them out of the den at 10 days of age, they get used to the human scent before their ears open. You still see fear, but they attach that weird sound to a familiar smell. You start talking at around 3 weeks of age, you've been doing this forever, and they go and hide. And you actually have to go breathe on them so they can smell you. And then they run up to you like you've saved them from this scary noise monster. But they start to attach what you sound like to what you smell like. But as adults, they're really focusing down on olfaction. So they're not generalizing the way the dogs do, which makes this socialization process much harder. Probably a really good thing if you're a wolf. You don't want to accidentally socialize with a bear or a deer or anything like that. But with the dogs, socializing with humans meant that they could get better access to food. So that was a really great adaptation for them. So that's what we think is going on there. Now, this is kind of interesting for livestock guarding dogs in that we think there may also possibly be variation between breeds. And this idea comes from some preliminary data that I collected on different dog breeds at 5 weeks of age. So basically at 5 weeks of age, we'd expect there to be this mild amount of fear already, right? But not a whole lot, just a little bit of fear. And so we ran these pups through a mock vet exam, basically placed on a slippery table. They get their feet palpated and a stethoscope put on them, and their ears checked and their eyes checked and all of that sort of thing. And we see how they feel about that on a scale from 0, meaning absolutely no fear, to 5, meaning they're so scared that they go catatonic and they don't recover when they're placed back in their home pen. And we looked at poodles, Labrador retrievers, and German shepherds. The poodles look pretty much like what we'd expect them to. They're clumping around 2 on the fear scale, which is some fear, but not a lot of fear. It's kind of a mild amount of fear. A little bit above, a few a bit below. The Labrador retrievers are way below where we'd expect. They're clumping around 0, which is less fear than we'd expect at this age on average. And the German shepherds are clumping around 3, with some going up to 5. So they're showing more moderate to extreme fear that we wouldn't expect till they were older. And so there does seem to be variation around this response at this age, which suggests that there might be differences in the development, the timing of development of fear. And so where our normal dogs are reaching this avoidance of novelty at 7 weeks, our Labradors don't seem to be having as much fear at 5 weeks. So they may be developing more slowly and reaching the end of the critical period at 9 weeks. Whereas our German Shepherds were developing fear more quickly, potentially, because we're seeing so much fear at 5 weeks. They may be ending their critical period around 7 weeks. This is interesting for livestock guarding dogs because we'd expect that this might be, if there's selection on this time period, this would be a place where you'd expect to see it in livestock guarding dogs, where the most important thing is that they have time to socialize with other species. So there's potential for that. We don't know if it happens. We'll talk about that in the what we want to know section. All right, are we still okay? Checking real quick here. Okay, so does early socialization to other species require physical contact between the pup and the other animal, or will be adjacent? So that's a great question. There were experiments with rabbits where they just had them in separate pens, and that did something. The question is, though, whether that, how much socialization that allows. It depends what you want to do, right? So if this is true with any kind of socialization. Usually people are worried about like socializing with humans, in which case, if you socialize them on the other side of the pen, they'd be good with people on the other side of the pen, but they wouldn't be good with people inside the pen. And we get dogs we call kennel spooks that are just like that. They're all sweet and happy when someone's on the other side of the fence. You open up the fence and they kind of freak out and run away, and they're super spooky. This study hasn't been done with dogs and livestock, but I would expect it would be similar in that you'd get some socialization occurring, but not to the level that you might want for guarding, especially if, so with chickens, I think what you really want were some chickens that maybe had that experience of dogs on the other side of the fence, so they got used to it. But your dogs that are guarding them, you'd really want to be raised with the chickens, ideally. I can't say for sure that that wouldn't do it, but I would expect that it wouldn't be ideal. Sorry, I don't have a definitive answer on that, but that's the basic idea. And if you have more questions around that, we can deal with that at the end too. But yeah, that's the, I'll give you some time to think about whether I answered that properly or not. Okay, I don't think there's any other questions about confusion about what we're talking about, but we'll definitely deal with some of these other ones at the end. Okay, so last one for this is flight distance. I think I jumped a slide there. There we go. So flight distance is this last chunk for the hazard avoidance section. And as I mentioned, flight distance is how close you let something frightening approach you before you run, and how far you run once you start running. And those two things tend to be tightly correlated. So if you let something get fairly close, you tend not to run very far. And if you don't let something get close, you tend to run quite far. Dogs in general have very short flight distances because probably of this same shifted critical period thing, same reason as they are very easy to socialize with other species. This is kind of a funny picture, but basically what this is a fantastic test created by this gentleman in Finland named Asko Sorvan. And we are actually doing some work with them right now, but he created this test where he has these taxidermied animals. This is the bear, who we're doing most of our work with responses to the bear, on a remote controlled base. And dogs are then given the experience of coming upon this bear after smelling some bear feces that he gets from a zoo. They come around the corner and this bear comes out. You can see Asko behind the blind in the top section there, and he's controlling the bear and allowing it to approach and retreat from the dog, depending on the dog's response. People do this for all different reasons. Some livestock guardian dog owners do this to see how the dog is going to respond to different predators, if they're just going to run for it, or if they'll stay back and bark like they want them to, or if they're actually going to go up and attack the animal, which they don't want, obviously. But pet owners, people going out and hunting deer or what have you that might bump into these animals and just want to know in a safe area what will happen. And so here are two dogs with two slightly different flight distances, but both are relatively small. With the wolf, if they encountered something frightening, they would smell it and you'd never see them. They wouldn't be within visual distance of the bear, so they'd be out of there if they could. The dogs allow things to get very close. So this dog on the top has a pretty short flight distance. He's just, you can kind of see from his body posture there, this is a freeze frame from a video. He's about to run right there. So that is his flight distance. On the bottom, we have another dog who has a much longer flight distance. The bear's just in the corner there and he's just about to run. The cool thing about this is if you watch the video, which I have coming up here, you'll see that the dogs don't just start running at that distance. They try to maintain that distance from the bear. So as the bear retreats, they kind of keep that same distance away from the bear. So we'll just let this play for a second. This is another dog who has a lovely, stay back and bark, although maybe for a bear a little close. And as the bear retreats, he approaches, and as the bear approaches and gets into that distance, he retreats, but he's not going to the hills. He's actually just right there, and he comes back when the bear retreats. So this is a pretty fixed distance, but it's for an individual dog. We don't know how this plays out, say, within breed, or if there's how much of this is based on their early experience versus the critical period, etc. So all we really know is that it has to do with this time period, and it is a trait that is measurable in animals, but we don't know much more at this point. Okay, so that brings us to what we are trying to figure out. So this is stuff that I am either in the process of right now working on or that we're about to start. So the first thing we want to do is remeasure the time of that critical period that I keep talking about, that ability to walk and avoidance of novelty. So as I mentioned, there's a whole lot of research on this in dogs, but it was all done in the 50s and 60s. And it was really hard to measure when the avoidance of novelty actually occurs, because as soon as the dog experiences something during this time period, it becomes familiar. So you can't re-expose them to the same thing. Plus, they generalize really well. So if I expose them to one noisy, bouncy toy that moves on its own, and then expose them to another noisy, bouncy toy that moves on its own, they'll probably think that's somewhat familiar and not entirely novel. So the way they got around that back in the day was to raise animals in a really impoverished environment and then expose them to humans at different time points. We would like to redo it with well-enriched dogs. Also, the measurement of walking is pretty much people just looking at them and going, aha, they're walking now. We would like something more quantitative that we can compare across dogs, different breeds, as well as wolves. So what we are doing is first we're measuring the ability to walk with these cool little things called accelerometers. They're very much like something you'd find in your smartwatch, but this is specifically just to measure the acceleration and deacceleration of this little, you see in the left picture there, that little red box. And it basically outputs a little line that varies in how much the animal is accelerating and decelerating. And we teach an artificial intelligence using video to determine what those little lines mean as far as how coordinated the walking of this puppy is. And so we've put these little backpacks on a bunch of pups and found out it does indeed work. So that is exciting. And now we are gathering as much data as we can on as many different kinds, sizes, breeds of dogs, as well as wolves, to give us an idea of the variation of when dogs start to walk and how that compares with wolves. And then on the other side, for the avoidance of novelty, we are exposing pups to this funny thing in the right-hand picture there. The New York Times called it our jiggly monster. It's basically a tripod with a mobile motor, so it spins, a white noise maker. On the mobile motor, we have this rubber frisbee with bird scarers hanging off, and it slowly spins around in circles and makes white noise sounds, and is rather ominous for puppies who have never seen anything like this before. We also have the advantage of, we tell the breeders to avoid exposing their pups to tripods or mobiles and white noise. So that's easy enough to do, but as soon as a puppy experiences it, it's still not novel anymore. So each pup gets exposed to it once between the ages of 4 to 8 weeks, and then once again at 8 weeks to see how they respond. And then we just get a whole lot of pups from each group to figure out what their trajectory is as far as when they start to become too scared to explore this. Our preliminary data is looking really good. And I'm now in a lab that does genetics. So we're also interested in where in the genome are we seeing these differences encoded. So each animal, dog or wolf, gets half its genetic material from its mom and half from its dad. And the full complement of genetic material is known as a genome. And so the dog and the wolf genome are each made up of about 2.8 billion base pairs. So these base pairs are just letters you may recall from intro biology, A, T, C, and G, and some of them code for proteins and are called genes. So we collect this genetic data using a saliva swab, which puppies are super excited about participating with. And then we look to see if there's any association between the genes that are present in the pup and the behavior that they're showing. There's a little bit of a hitch with this, which is that there's a whole bunch of differences in the genes between dogs and wolves. And there's also a whole bunch of differences in behavior. And morphology or phenotypes, these traits that we can measure. And so if we find a difference in the genome that associates with our behavior, we can't entirely be sure it's because of that behavior or because of other reasons that separate dogs versus wolves. So to get at that, we're also looking at wolf dogs, which are mixes between dogs and wolves from sanctuaries across the country. Like I mentioned, in any animal, half the genome comes from each parent. So if we have a dog parent and a wolf parent, the dog parent will provide some dog genes and the wolf parent will provide some wolf genes, and we'll end up with a wolf dog. At this point, they're not terribly useful to us because they have one set of genes that's all dog and one set of genes that's all wolf. But if we mix them again, then one parent will give some dog genes and some wolf genes, while the other parent gives some wolf genes and some dog genes, and we get a mix that's now useful to us because it has some areas where it's both dog and wolf, some areas where it's entirely wolf, and some areas where it's entirely dog. And if we get a whole bunch of those animals and look at how they behave, we can try to find places where the more dog-acting animals have dog genes and the more wolf-acting animals have wolf genes, and get a good idea of what genes are contributing to these behavioral differences. And so we've done that. We went and got saliva samples, or in the cases where these animals couldn't be swabbed, some of them are a little less eager to participate than our puppies. We got first samples for the DNA, and then we looked at how they responded to novel objects and strangers. So these are both things, remember, that come out of that critical period. And so that's something we're finishing up now. We would also like to do all of this with different dog breeds, especially with livestock guarding dogs, because, as I mentioned, it would make a lot of sense that we'd see variation in this timing in those breeds. And we've also been talking with Bill about potentially looking at mixed breed livestock guarding dogs and doing the same sort of project we've done with the hybrids, but instead of mixes between dogs and wolves, we'd be looking at mixes between, say, five different livestock guarding dog breeds and looking for the differences in, say, attentiveness between those animals and trying to find the underlying genomics for that. Okay, so I'm running out of time and I don't want to zip through this last part too fast. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview about, we don't know a lot about this time period. So I'm going to just give you a real quick overview. The foraging part of things, basically, as I mentioned, dogs are scavengers, but they still have a lot of the wolf hunting behavior. And that includes things like chasing and biting, dissecting, which is pulling stuff apart. And these are obviously things you don't want in livestock guarding dogs, but they vary across multiple breeds. So you have some breeds that are purpose-bred to have chunks of this behavior, like herding dogs or Schutzhund dogs. And what we would like to try to figure out is how that happens. How do you have a dog develop these different sequences? And how have we bred dogs to have specific sequences? And what are the genes underlying that? And so that is something we'd also really like to get livestock guarding dog data on, because they are particularly exciting in the fact that they should not have these motor patterns ideally. Obviously, sometimes they pop up, but the selection on them is really extreme. So I'm just going to jump to what we're doing here on this. Obviously, there's more stuff here, but we could talk about that during questions. So what we're doing, in the past, I've gathered some data on this, but we're really interested in when these motor patterns first show up. And the time they first show up is during the primary critical period of socialization, our favorite time period. And we think what is going on is that the earlier they show up, the more likely they'll be included in the adult sequence. Basically, they show up and they get shuffled into play behavior. And the more the pup uses them, the more likely that it'll show up in the adult. And so we think what might be going on is that different pups, different breeds may have different onset times for these motor patterns when they first appear. So you might see chase earlier in a breed that is supposed to have chase, like a border collie, but you'd see it later in a livestock guarding dog right at the end of the critical period when it's less likely to get included in those play bouts, and it's more easy to get rid of. We don't know if this is true. I do have some preliminary data suggesting there are differences between breeds, but it's really hard to gather this data in the volumes that we need for behavioral differences, let alone genetic differences. So what we're trying to do is collect a whole lot of data, and we're doing this by using nest cams. This is in this slide, you can see the nest cam footage from a litter we're working with right now to try this technology out. These guys are almost 2 weeks now. This is a few days ago. See if it'll, oops, not playing. There it goes. So we basically can put these nest cams in and they turn on whenever the pups move. And in that way, we can gather their play bouts. I have a whole lot of footage of puppy play bouts at all different ages throughout the first 2 to 8 weeks of life. And then we are creating an app so that we're basically gamifying something called behavioral coding, which we normally do, and it takes a long time. We watch these videos and we hit buttons when they do any of the behaviors we're interested in. But someone like me has to sit down for thousands of hours and do that, and that takes a long time. So instead, we're trying to turn it into an app on the phone where anybody can get on and learn the behavior that they're supposed to hit the button on, and then watch 1-minute video clips and hit the button. And then we can look across thousands of people and find out when everybody agrees that this behavior happened, and have the first time that motor pattern appears. And at the same time, we can get DNA from all of these pups and see if we can determine the genetic underpinnings for the timing of those behaviors. And in the livestock guardian dog breeds, we'd love to then also look at things like how are they performing in the field with things like attentiveness and that sort of thing. So I kind of blew through that last bit fast. So if you have more questions on that, I'm happy to answer. And I will just conclude with the fact that the primary critical period of socialization in dogs is an important developmental period in terms of developing desired behaviors in individual working dogs over their lifetime, as well as determining the evolution of dogs from wolves and possibly the evolution of later selection on lines of working dogs. So if you are interested in potentially participating in any of these things, you can reach me at this email. You can also probably contact Bill, and we'll probably put out a call when we actually get going through the Facebook and everything. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lord. I appreciate that. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot myself, and some of the things that you mentioned are kind of answering some questions that I've had and things that I've seen in our bonding project. So I'll scroll kind of back through the chat here. For anybody that didn't see it, I will mention just real quick that this webinar will be recorded, and we'll get it posted to our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So if you missed anything or logged in late, you'll be able to check it out there. There was a first question. This was back earlier in your presentation. They were asking about which week or age. I think probably should the dog be socialized to sheep.
Mm-hmm. So that I'm just gonna, sorry, not to make anyone sick here, get back to one of the many versions of this picture. So when the ideal time to socialize them with anything, including sheep, would be between 4 and 8 weeks. And so I believe in a lot of Ray's work, he suggests getting them out into with the sheep as early as possible in this time period and for as much of this time period as possible. Just the more, it's like with any socialization with dogs, the more exposure, the more positive exposure they get during this time, the better socialized they'll be. The better socialized they are, the more attentive they should be. So if you can get, this is your peak time. between 4 and 8 weeks is your peak time. and it needs to be positive experience though. If you're putting them out there with like sheep who are headbutting them and chasing them or running away from them, that's not good, obviously. But yes, between 4 and 8 weeks is the golden time. But you can extend that out. Like I mentioned, there is some possibility of interfering and making this a bit longer, but this is the whole point for livestock guarding dogs, so there's no reason not to be doing it during this time.
The next one, is there a difference between pups bred in a single dog home, so they only see one adult dog, versus pups bred in a place with multiple adult dogs around?
Yeah, there's no precise studies done on that, but I would extrapolate from what we do know that you would probably see some differences. It's easiest to think about in terms of, what they see is what they'll be used to. So if they get used to one dog, that will tell them a lot about dogs, but that dog may have some idiosyncratic things about it that make it different from other dogs as well. So the more variation, the broader the socialization. So you can think about it from the point of people as well. If a dog only ever sees me, they'll be good with people in general, but they'll be most comfortable with women of my stature and, hair color. And if a guy with a 7-foot guy with a really deep voice and a beard and a hat and sunglasses show up, that might make them a bit nervous. Whereas if they had a broader exposure to people, that would not faze them because they've gotten used to all sorts of things. So the same thing is true with dogs. Just we're not as aware of the differences in dogs. But if they're really used to a Chihuahua and they suddenly meet maybe a passive really calm Chihuahua, and they really meet a hyperactive Great Dane, that might be unnerving for them. So the more variation in the dog, the more they'll be good with dogs in general, if that makes sense.
The next question is, do you see these methods being utilized by livestock guarding dog breeders to determine which pups will make the best dogs for the job? I don't know if you'd like me to probably tackle that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, honestly, no, I don't see a lot of these methods being used by livestock guardian dog breeders. I think mainly just because they don't know a lot about canine behavior. There are some people out there and breeders that have some background and have taken the time to learn these kind of things, but I think the majority of them probably are not doing that. Hopefully, maybe they're watching this presentation today from Dr. Lord, and maybe they'll start doing some more of these type of things. Next question up is, have you done studies on OCD behavior, especially in livestock guarding dogs?
So that's something people in the lab I'm in right now have done work on, looking at the genetic underpinnings of OCD behavior. It wasn't in livestock guarding dogs. It was in what was it in? I think Dobermans. It is something there's a bit of work on. I'm not familiar with anything in livestock guarding dogs, but it's an interesting area, especially with the genetics connection, as there's been some success in finding that some of the OCD behaviors that are related to the hunting, foraging behaviors like chasing tails, that sort of thing. I'm interested in potentially doing some more work and when we start looking at those behaviors to see if there's any overlap with the development of the behavior itself. But yeah, as far as specifically in livestock guarding dogs, I'm not familiar with work on that area, but it would be a cool area to look at.
The next question, is there hope to socialize a livestock guardian dog with goats if they've missed the 8-week period?
I mean, I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's just like, it's just starting at a disadvantage, I guess I would say. And I'd expect your attentiveness to be not nearly as good as an animal who is socialized with the species of interest. I mean, the way this all originated back in Europe when they were using this back in the old days, is just that the dogs grew up with in with whatever livestock it was, let's say goats, and the people were around, and the goats were there, and they just automatically, without people having to worry about it, socialized with the livestock, because there's a ton of them, and a bit with the people too. And so you end up with a dog who's not scared of people, but particularly attentive to the goats, which is exactly what you want. And so you don't have to worry about anything. So it's not, it's sort of like the stairs, right? I'm not saying you couldn't possibly do it. It's just you have to work a whole lot harder to get what you want, instead of just working with the natural development of the dog, I guess would be the best way to think about it.
I remember you speaking about this, but you'll probably remember better here. It says, the next question is, if out to 4 to 8 weeks, then how many hours per day?
So, again, the more, the better. You also have to consider that you probably don't want them. So Ray talks a lot about this in his work, where you have this delicate balance of, you want them mostly socialized with the livestock. So you don't want them to be dogs who are too focused on the people, but there's also this trade-off of, if they are completely unsocialized with people, you end up with other problems. So if you think about the fact that the time that they're spending with whomever during this time is going to be reflected in how well socialized they are with that species, you'd want them to be spending more time with the livestock than the people. That makes sense. I know that's not as specific as you want it to be. There's not really good data on the precise number of hours that are needed for this, that I know of. But if you have them, if during that time, 80% of the time they're with people and 20% of the time they're with livestock, they're going to prefer people to livestock. We know that.
Next question is, no experience with livestock, but positive human experience during the critical period better than negative experiences? They're asking this because the breeder of their dogs doesn't socialize with livestock until after 12 weeks.
So yeah, we're running into that same problem where you're not working with the animal's development. But yeah, if you start a dog off early with bad experiences with the livestock that you want, then you're making it even worse for yourself. If they're like, no, sheep are bad, that's worse than sheep are, I don't know. But yes, if you're skipping that 4 to 8 week period, we find this a lot in, so I've done a lot of work also with guide dogs. And they tend to, they're getting better at it, but they used to totally ignore this time period. And then they'd have dogs who were scared of, car horns or stairs or what have you. And the easy fix is expose them to all this between 4 and 8 weeks. And that's the same with the livestock guarding dogs. The easy fix is just expose them to all of this during this period. It's not that you can't work around it, but it's more of a question of why work around it, when the whole beauty of the livestock guarding dog is that they've been evolutionarily, developed to do this for you. And so by skipping that, you've just set yourself back on how good that dog could possibly be. If you think about, in any individual, they have a range of possible endpoints, from the time they're born to the adult behavior they could have. Any dog has a variation in that, including how good a livestock guarding dog they could be. And if you give them this early experience, you're pushing them towards that best possible outcome. And if you don't, they're going to be somewhere to the left of that. How far depends on a lot of things. But if you put them in a bad experience, you're going to push them even further to the left. I'd say that. That would be my answer there.
The next question is, they have a male livestock guardian dog who's excellent with sheep, but is predatory towards lambs under 2 weeks old. He was raised with sheep from 7 weeks old, but did not experience his first lambing until 18 months old. My problem solely is my problem solely a socialization issue, or is it just bad genetics?
So it's never just genetics. It's never just environment. This is one thing we've learned in the animal behavior world. It's always both. But you've also got, it's not just the socialization there. The predatory stuff is that foraging behavior stuff I talked about, that we zipped through fast. And there is more on this. If you want to read, Coppinger's work has some more on this, more applicable stuff on this as well. But basically, in the livestock guarding dogs, we see these motor patterns sometimes turn on late, 7-8 weeks out, and they start trying to chase sheep or bite sheep or things like that. And usually what's suggested is to remove them from the sheep at that point. So they're not directing those motor patterns at those contexts, because they could have grab, bite, or chase, as long as they don't use it on the sheep. And that would be ideal. Ideally, they wouldn't have any of it, but the way you get them to not put it in that particular context is by removing that context while they're developing that behavior. And so that could also be coming into play where they had a late onset of that behavior and directed it towards perhaps something small, and then generalized that to the lambs. It's not 100%. I'm not 100% sure that's what happens, but there is that element of foraging behavior there too, not just socialization. But the fact that they weren't socialized with lambs is interesting, in that usually if you have really good socialization, that helps with not having those behaviors directed towards that species. You can actually break a border collie by raising them with sheep. They actually then have a really hard time herding sheep because they don't do a good job of holding eye on them, because they're socialized with them. So that's kind of a cool extra accessory. But you do get livestock guarding dogs developing this motor pattern late and start directing it towards sheep sometimes, which creates problems. And so it may have been something like that as well.
The next question, you mentioned seeing motor patterns early. Do you think that the hunting motor pattern onset is different in some protection dogs? I have had two WLGSDs, I'm not sure what breed that is, who showed no interest in retrieving or biting until they switched on, one at 4.5 months and one at 12 months. They believe the experience is the same with some others. They don't believe that they can pick the best pup at the litter stage for the working purpose of biting and ball retrieve drive.
Yeah, so German Shepherds are actually one working line I did work with on this earlier project. We're looking at Schutzhund dogs. And the preliminary evidence suggested they have a really early onset of grab, bite, and chase. And that sort of late stuff you're talking about is the secondary critical period of socialization, which I didn't talk about at all, but there's a reason it's called the primary critical period, because there's a secondary critical period, which is around puberty. We know very little about it in dogs, except that it's probably a thing. And so that where that comes in with the foraging behaviors is this sort of higher level rulemaking. So in the pups, I'm going to throw a whole bunch of stuff at you, so this doesn't get really confusing. In the pups, you have the turning on of the individual pieces, the orient, the eye, the stalk, the chase, the grab, bite, and they sequence them together into whatever their sequence may be. If it's the German Shepherd, if it's just a German Shepherd, it's orient, chase, grab, bite. And you see a lot of those motor patterns in play. But then later, they develop these higher level rules about how and when they're going to show those motor patterns as a sequence. And so it may be that what's happening later on, especially in a lot of working line dogs, and the reason we can't say, this is a good dog until they're older, is because of that secondary critical period where these higher level rules are coming into place. But we do see very early onset of the individual motor patterns in working line German Shepherds. It's just, yes, it may not be possible to say, this is a good working dog until they're over a year for those other reasons. I hope that wasn't super confusing.
Next question, how do you see your previous work comparing dopamine levels between border collies and livestock guardian dogs come into play as it relates to reducing expression of foraging behaviors in livestock guardian dogs? How does that show up or change over the ontogeny of the pups?
So I haven't done anything with dopamine specifically. Other people have. I mean, as far as the differences in dopamine between the different breeds that are showing different motor patterns, I suspect where that comes into play is more with a general activity level, more of an activation sort of, for lack of a better word. So this overall activity rather than specifically to particular motor patterns. But yes, so Cindy Ahrens, I believe, did some really cool stuff with that, looking at differences in neurotransmitters between these groups, which has to do likely with these differences in motor patterns, but in a more overarching way, a less specific way. We may be wrong. It may turn out that the genes underlying the turning on of these motor patterns does have to do with neurotransmitters more directly. We really don't know, although we do have some good evidence that it's highly heritable from a paper we just published looking at pet dogs and behavior and pet dog breeds. Where the behaviors that had to do with motor patterns were the highest as far as heritability, meaning the differences between them were most due to variation in genes rather than environment, as opposed to any other behavior. So things like retrieving and pointing and howling, which are all motor patterns, were highly heritable for behaviors. So we should get some cool data, and we'll see if it has anything to do with dopamine.
The next one, I think they have an unsocialized livestock guardian dog to humans. It's fearful of one person in the family, but it's great with livestock. They want to know if there's any hope of getting their livestock guardian dog to come around her husband.
Yeah, so this is like the stairs thing. It's totally possible to do the habituation thing. It's just a long haul. So it's going to be a slow process, and if he changes his hat, it may ruin everything sort of problem. But you can, over the lifetime of an animal, get them, especially if it's a specific person, get them more used to and more comfortable with that person through classic training methods, click and treat, that sort of thing. They're never going to be, I won't say never. Sometimes when dogs get into like their senior years, everything shifts around as far as socialization, and they suddenly decide they love people, even though they never did. But pretty much that dog is not going to be like, this guy is my best friend. But you might be able to get it so he's not the boogeyman. It's just going to be a slow, careful training process instead of the easy, hey, look at this person for 5 minutes, you're good, that you could have done when they were young. But you can totally do it. It's just going to be slow, and he's probably not going to be snuggling with him or anything like that.
The next question is, in this context, are you using the term sensitive and critical socialization periods interchangeably? I've read that dogs have no critical periods, only sensitive. Do you disagree?
Yeah, so that's a terminology thing that comes up a lot in the animal behavior world. So when it was originally discussed, it was called the critical period, the primary critical period of socialization, which is what I tend to use. There was pushback on that, and it became the sensitive period of socialization. And the pushback was that there wasn't a really strict delineation. So it didn't like suddenly start and suddenly stop. Like I showed you, there's this sensitivity that kind of increases and then decreases. And so they wanted to call it a sensitive period. My problem with that is that the critical never referred to the timing. The critical refers to the fact that it is critical in the development of the behavior of the animal. This time period has an amazing effect on how the animal is going to behave as an adult. And so that is why I still use the term critical. It means the same thing when people talk about a sensitive period or a critical period. It means the same thing. But I think the fact that it's so important, really, I like the term critical for that reason. So yeah.
So the secondary critical period is where you can also have additional behavior issues. We had a livestock guardian dog who was great until 10 months and then started playing with 4-month-old kid goats and leaving marks. Had to separate him for a while. What's the best way to get through this? We were told to use an e-collar to discourage this behavior.
Yeah, so I know there's stuff out there on opinions about how to do this best. As far as the secondary critical period, yeah, absolutely. This is a problem time in every working dog line. Puberty is when everybody goes, it was going great, and then, oh my God, what just happened with this dog? Across jobs, this happens. Sadly, there's very little good research on this time period, and it's a lot harder to research than the primary critical period because instead of having a whole clump of puppies in a litter that we can study, they've all gone their separate ways. So it's much harder. We are starting to try to do this. The first key is figuring out, we don't even know what the biomarkers are for the beginning and end of this period yet in dogs, like we do with the primary critical period, the walking and the avoidance of novelty. We just have to find those, and then we know when it's happening. With the secondary critical period, we don't even have a good, aha, this is where it starts and this is where it ends. And it clearly differs. I mean, puberty obviously happens at different times in different breeds. So we're working on it. I'm really sorry I don't have a good answer for you. But I do know there is information out there in the training world about suggestions on how to deal with this. E-collar wouldn't be my first choice, but I would defer to livestock people working with livestock guardian dogs to what has worked best for them. Certainly getting them out of the situation would seem key so that they aren't doing it and reinforcing that behavior with your livestock. But yeah.
Next one, excellent webinar, super helpful information for livestock guardian dog breeders like me. Would love to continue this conversation on second. Oh, well, you're being asked for a second webinar already, Dr.
We're
Lord,
getting to the foraging stuff. Yeah, no, I'd love to do the foraging stuff. I wasn't sure how long I would take, but I'd be happy to talk about the actual foraging thing as a different thing and really get into that, because I think that's just as key for the livestock guardian dogs stuff as the socialization.
Folks, I'll do one last question here, and then I'll let everybody log off. I ask as a client who's, whoops, it keeps moving. Sorry, I've got posts coming up and it's moving my question here. When an LSGD alerts to an intruder, it is staying below threshold, working with logical brain and responding on adrenaline dopamine hit or trigger staking.
I'm trying to figure out what the question is here.
Oh,
here we go. Oh, no, is that a new one? Alert intruder. Is it staying below threshold, working logically and responding adrenaline, or trigger stacking? Okay, I think I understand what you're asking here. I'm sorry if I don't actually answer the question. So we actually did a whole paper on barking. What we think is happening when they're barking is actually that they're conflicted. So we think barking is a conflict signal, basically comes from mobbing. So I want to run away, but I can't, or I want to go chase, but I can't, or I want to go towards something, but I can't. And so then they start barking. It can also be learned in certain situations, like I bark and the mailman leaves. Ideally, in a livestock guardian dog, they would be remaining in a useful working state. That's certainly possible. I mean, you could get a dog that just gets so overwhelmed that it doesn't know what it's doing. But ideally, this is in a good working dog. They are a good livestock guardian dog. They are socialized with the, let's say, sheep. There's something unnerving approaching them, but they're not going to leave the sheep because they're socialized with them. And so they don't run away. And because they're not running away, they bark at the scary thing. Now, the scary thing is usually a predator and relies on the fact that it needs to sneak up on its prey. So the barking interrupts that sequence, that foraging sequence that I didn't get to talk about, and they have to leave. And so that's ideally what's going on. in the scenario. It can be that the dog gets so worked up about the predator and chases it off and, gets into its own other behavioral sequences instead of that sort of, I don't know quite what to do with this situation, so I'm going to bark, rather than just becoming a non-functional animal and falling apart or running away from the sheep and leaving them there. So you ideally want them in that sort of halfway state of, I'm not going to leave because these are mine, these are my sheep, these are my people. But that thing is unnerving, so it starts them barking. I'm not sure if that really answered your question. I'm sorry.
It just popped up. It should clarify it was a pet dog on a leash, but calms quickly.
Okay. Yeah, leashes increase barking too, because that also means you can't approach or retreat. So being in a leash, being behind a fence, being in a car, all of it keeps you from going towards or away from whatever you want to go towards or away from, and puts them into this barking state, this conflict state. And so it can be so conflicting that they just kind of lose their minds, or it can be just relaxed, like, I don't know what to do, I'm gonna bark.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Lord, for your time today and giving this presentation. I know, as I mentioned, there's a lot of people already asking for a second webinar, so I'll be in touch with you about that. So thank you again for taking the time, and I hope you'll do a second webinar for us.
Absolutely. We'll pair it with that start of that project so we can get people involved in getting their puppies on nest cams and watching puppies and hitting buttons for us.
Well, I just want to close real quickly. Again, I do want to thank our sponsor for today, Lone Star Tracking, also the Sheep and Goat Predator Management Board for providing the funding for our program here, and Dr. Redden for his support and guidance of the Livestock Guardian Dog program here at the center. So thank you very much for watching, everyone. Our next webinar is kind of scheduled for February. Check out our Facebook page for more information as that comes a little bit closer. Thank you very much for watching, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.